Good afternoon. I'm Dorothy Biberman, Director of Global Engagements and Executive Initiatives at the Association of Schools and Programs of Public Health. Welcome and thank you for joining the 2020 ASPPH Virtual Annual Meeting Session, Academic Public Health Challenges and Responses During Social and Political Unrest. We hope you can all join us for the complete ASPPH Virtual Annual Meeting program every Friday until May 15th, except for next Friday. All sessions will be recorded and the links will be available on our webpage. It's now my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's session, Dr. Barbara Reimer, Dean and Alumni Distinguished Professor of the University of North Carolina Gilling School of Global Public Health. Dean Reimer.
Thank you, Dorothy. You and everybody at ASPPH have been doing such a great job on such short notice, and I really appreciate everything that you've been doing. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to get together with and learn from our speakers and the ASPPH community today. I'm honored to moderate this session on academic public health challenges and responses during social and political unrest. I want to welcome everybody who's watching today and those who will be watching later. You're really an important part of the presentation, and your questions will make this a richer experience. So just a little background. Faculty and staff members and students in schools and programs of public health have really valuable perspectives, knowledge, expertise, and skills when thinking about and trying to address political and social unrest affecting their local campuses, communities, countries, and globally. Because of the equity lens with which public health operates, we can bring a valuable public health perspective to the issues that cause campus unrest and propose solutions. I think that perspective, because it includes a strong equity lens, really legitimizes our presence in these events. I found it very helpful in speaking about our campus's issues around a Confederate statue. We collectively understand context and are used to collaborating with many kinds of stakeholders. Today, we are fortunate to have on our panel academic public health leaders from Hong Kong and Beirut, Lebanon, with additional perspective from Chile, 3 places deeply affected by unrest in response to political and economic issues. Each of these speakers has had fascinating experiences, and we're going to learn a lot from their firsthand experience and the insights they've gained from weathering the crises that they'll talk about. In looking at their slides ahead of time, I was really struck by the scale of violence, the really stunning amount of violence that they've experienced. And I really want you to think about that as we go through this today. A few questions that may come to mind as we absorb news of civil unrest and that we will be discussing today are thinking about the capacity, the extent, and how do members of the Academy become involved as advisors, as educators, as people who actually must respond as advocates? And what about taking our places on the front lines? Many public health experts in the Academy also are highly skilled practitioners, knowledgeable about the science and the best practices in their disciplines. So let's think about our role and responsibility as we listen to the speakers. And while we dream of a time in which all people live equitably in justice, peace, and health, daily news updates remind us that we're not there yet. Given our mission as public health academicians, we do well to maximize our effectiveness during times of unrest, even as we work for a more just and healthier world. And as we think about what we're facing now in terms of a horrific global pandemic, which we couldn't have even imagined when this presentation was first put together, I think that can change how we think about the unrest and ask how COVID-19 will exacerbate many of the conditions that set the stage for unrest. I'm going to introduce our 3 distinguished panelists, and at the conclusion of their remarks, we'll have a Q&A session, which I'll moderate, and I really want to encourage you to submit questions using the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. So I'm going to introduce each speaker first, and then they'll talk in order. So Esteban Hadiez, Janice Johnston, and Jocelyn DeYoung. So Esteban is public health professor in the Department of Health Promotion, American University of Beirut, Lebanon, and in the Departamento Pública University Valparaíso, Chile. He holds a PhD in public health from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and he's going to be giving an introduction to public health issues during times of unrest, and he'll also bring the example of Chile. Janice Johnston is Associate Professor, the MPH Program Director, and Deputy Director of Education, University of Hong Kong, MPH, and she'll give an overview of the situation in that country. And then Jocelyn de Jong is Professor and Associate Dean for Academic and Faculty Affairs, American University of Beirut, Faculty of Health Sciences, and she'll talk about the situation in Lebanon. So after each speaker, after we go through each of the panelists, at the conclusion of their remarks, we'll have a Q&A session, as I mentioned, and you can submit questions in writing at any time during the session. Just click on the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen, and then we'll hold questions until all the presentations are finished. So I would first like to invite Dr. Hadias to begin. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you very much. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening. The title of the, yes, thank you. The title of the presentation, as you said, is Academic Public Health Challenges and Responses During Social and Political Unrest. However, at the beginning of this presentation, I wonder what do we mean by challenges or responses? For what? To contribute to dialogue and conflict resolution, to continue with our normal teaching and disregard to a certain extent what is happening outside our schools, or actually to be involved and to engage actively in social transformation. This presentation takes this third perspective, and I will try to argue how many of our ideological and theoretical tools that we have in the discipline actually do not allow us in the first place to understand what is happening outside, and second, they do not allow us to actively be engaged and transform reality. As you said, my name is Esteban Hadias. I'm a public health professor at the American University of Beirut and Universidad de Valparaíso in Chile. And most of my career, I have been involved in research of social movements, community participation in context of environmental conflict in northern Chile, in Huasco. First, if you please give me the, thank you. The Chilean protest, the last Chilean protest emerged in October 2019. And it involved the participation of 4.1 million protesters in Chile, according to Mario Rosas, which is the head of the Chilean police. It is around 23% of total population. We are talking about a massive scale of mobilization, but we need to understand that this moment of mobilization is not an isolated historical phenomenon, but is actually the continuation of years and years of practice and organization of different social movements. I won't go into details about the causes of the social unrest, but what I would like to say is that because of these protests, we have had on one hand, the possibility of removing and electing a new constitution. But on another hand, we have had massive and systematic human rights violation by the government of President Sebastián Piñera. These massive and systematic human rights violations have been supported by international reports from Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, and the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. So far, from the beginning of the protests until March 19, we have had 1,083 documented cases of torture and cruel treatment. If you can give me, please, the next slide. We have also had 237 documented cases of torture and sexual abuse, including rape, threats to rape, sexual harassment, and homophobic insults from the Chilean police and the military. 30% of these cases of torture and sexual abuse have been conducted over children and teenagers under 18 years old. Can you please give me the next one? We have also witnessed the imprisonment of 11,000 detainees, including 1,117 children. Please, the next one. The next one, okay, thank you. And we have also had 3,808 people wounded in hospitals, including 460 people being shot in their eyes. This has been one of the characteristics of the Chilean repression in Chilean protesters. And it is important to notice that this strategy of shooting at people's faces and eyes has also happened in the Arab uprisings, especially in Egypt and in the Kashmir region, and between Pakistan and India. We also have 34 documented deaths, 11 of them directly by the Chilean police and the army. Could you give me the next slide, please? There are also documented cases of police shooting bullets and tear gas inside hospitals and against healthcare workers. This has also been a characteristic of the Chilean repression. Please, the next slide. So this is the context that is happening in Chile, and I need to say I haven't been directly witnessing what is happening in Chile because I'm living in Beirut. However, this moment in Chilean history, and especially considering the new coronavirus pandemic, poses a lot of public health issues. In Chile, there is an illegitimate government that has violated massively and systematically human rights of Chilean population. It had, before the coronavirus crisis, 6% of approval from the people. And in a context of privatization and commodification of the health system, we need to wonder what is the possibility or what is the capability of such a government to address such a huge epidemiological crisis as it is the coronavirus. In this part of the presentation, and after introducing what is happening in my country, I would like to talk to you about to argue what I said at the beginning, how many of our theories of within the field of public health, our mainstream theories in the field of public health, do have some ideological and theoretical problems that do not allow us to understand in a good way what is happening outside. And I argue that the study of social movements, and in particular a Marxist approach to social movement, can contribute to a radically different perspective of understanding public health problems in our field. The study of social movements contributes, at least, we can discuss this in detail later, but I identify that it contributes, first of all, to an understanding of societies as always moving, always transforming, and always conflictual. This understanding of reality, this conception of reality, is different than the underlying ideological conception of reality let's say, the theory of social determinants of health or the theory of epidemiological transition, which are theories that have an understanding of societies as essentially harmonic, and therefore they see social movements, or they see poverty, or they see inequalities as a deviation of the normal functioning of societies and not at their core. In the study of social movements, even if there are many theories of social movements, all of them coincide in understanding the importance of conflict, not as a disruption, but as an essential aspect of contemporary societies. Another contribution from the study of social movements, and particularly a Marxist approach to social movements, is the understanding of the dialectic relationship between collective action and human subjectivity and objective material conditions where people live. In the field of public health, and again going back to the model of social determinants of health, we could say that it's highly structuralist. There is no place for us, or it is very difficult for us to recognize collective action and social transformation from what we could consider a very fixed and fragmented understanding of reality, that the one is characteristic of the theory of social determinants of health. And on the other hand, when we attempt to understand collective action and human subjectivity, we do it from very individualistic and decontextualized theories that propose that human beings are highly rational and highly autonomous. So we have these ideological extremes at the same time in the academia, in the field of public health. And it is very difficult, even if we usually think that they are complementary, the understanding of reality underlying each of these theories is not complementary, but it is contradictory. And this poses a lot of problems when we think about what to do. Do we approach a very structuralist approach that where there is no human agency, or where there is no collective action? Or do we approach, let's say, health promotion strategies from perspectives that think that human beings are highly rational and they are devoid from any context? We are always navigating between these two different positions. I argue that the Marxist approach and social movements in general do contribute to a more nuanced understanding of the relationship between objective conditions and human collective action and subjectivity. And the final idea that I think it requires a bit more of going in depth, but I won't do that, is the understanding of social movements as mediated expressions of class struggle. Again, when we include a Marxist approach to public health, and by referring to Marxism, I'm referring to a sophisticated understanding of Marxism, which is different than the Leninism, Stalinism understanding of it that is always prevalent in academia. And in this sense, the ideas of exploitation, capitalism, and violence become central for the understanding of social movements, but not only social movements, but also health inequalities. In other words, we could also think from the contributions of social movements and Marxism in particular, to understand health inequalities as a mediated epidemiological expression of an underlying class conflict. And therefore, if in a moment the problem was poverty and health inequalities, or poverty and health problems, and then it was inequalities as it is today, I would suggest that we need to move forward and to understand the idea of exploitation and to challenge exploitation itself in order to understand health inequalities and in order to overcome them. In summing up, I argue that one of the challenges, of the many challenges that schools of public health today in the world have in a context of social and political unrest, is that we do not have included theories that allow us to understand what is happening today, not as exceptions, but actually as the normal result of very unequal societies that are the characteristic of today neoliberal societies.
Thank you very much. You've given us a lot to think about, Esteban, and I think your final comment about what's happening and whether it's now the norm or whether it's an exception is something that we should come back to. So now I would like to turn to Janice Johnston to tell us about her experience. Thank you.
Hi, this is me. I'll just move forward. Tap here to control. It's not moving forward. There we go. Okay. So I don't know if I can move backwards. Okay. Can I move backwards? Can I get back to my first slide? Thank you. So what I'm going to talk about is activism, politics, and education, but in many ways similar but different from what Esteban was just talking about. And the situation here, or the locale here, is Hong Kong. I've lived in Hong Kong for a very long time. And since before the change, which was 1997, I've seen a lot of mass movements in Hong Kong. Or mass demonstrations. Because in Hong Kong, people don't have a democratic right like we're used to in Canada or we're used to in the United States, where we can exercise one person, one vote, or have other forms of voting that we might see in other parts of the world. So much of the Hong Kong government is appointed by the authorities in Hong Kong, and people would say that that is appointed by China rather than really by people in Hong Kong. So Hong Kong people have a very unique way of expressing their displeasure with what's happening in their government. And they do that by voting with their feet. And when they vote for their feet, they march. And they gather in a place in Hong Kong called Victoria Park, usually. And they move from Causeway Bay, which is part of downtown Hong Kong, and go towards the government offices. There have been millions of people marching. There used to be a regular march every July 1st, which was the handover day in 1997, from Britain as a colony to back to China. Most of these marches, almost all of them, are incredibly peaceful. And people take their children and they take their elderly, and people are in wheelchairs, and it is just a way of telling the government they're not very happy with the decisions that have been made. However, they've become more and more violent as we've progressed in time away from the 1997 reversion back to China. And the 2014 Occupy Central umbrella movement was probably an inflection point when things changed. So you can see from the pictures here on the screen, the yellow umbrellas were completely representative of the people marching out in the street. And if you wore a yellow tie when you went to work, or put on a yellow shirt, or had a yellow flag, you identified yourself with the people that were marching or speaking out against the government. And if you wore blue, you were pro-China, pro the government, pro the establishment, pro-control, as people in the yellow team would see that. And you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, the sign that says, "We'll be back," like Arnold Schwarzenegger. So what happened at the end of the Occupy Central protest, which lasted about 73 days and completely shut down the financial center of Hong Kong, the students and the protest leaders were unable to talk with or negotiate with the government. They were unable to get any concessions, any recognition that there were problems here, as Esteban was just talking about, that there were issues related to inequities, issues related to huge wealth disparity, just nothing. There was absolutely no movement, and their sign tells it all. We'll be back. And they came back with, I moved forward too much again, but that's okay. The last slide before was from June 16th. 2 million people marched in Hong Kong on June 16th. This followed a march that had taken place about 3 days earlier, when 1 million people marched. So a huge number of people. 2 million people is just short of about 30% of the Hong Kong population. And I can't imagine why that would not have brought about some kind of change in the way people were thinking at the governmental level about how to handle your population and how to handle your policies and how to think about what's happening in your city. You can see from the picture here that these are very young people. Many of them are under 30. And the picture on the left, they're very calm and they're not carrying weapons. Even these students have masks on, but they haven't got gas masks on. The young man right in the front has got the black, which you would see from some of the people that were right on the front line. They're called the magicians. But most of the people that are protesting would be wearing a surgical mask like they're wearing. They might wear a ball cap, and they would wear black clothes usually to align themselves with the new protest. And it would be very peaceful, and they would march and then they would go home and there'd be no problem. However, as you can see from the right, this changed. Because these very peaceful marches, just as with the 2014 Occupy Central, did not achieve what they were trying to achieve. And the protesters then engaged in more and more actions, violent actions, or more and more aggressive actions to try to get a response from the government. This was effectively a leaderless movement. The government couldn't identify anyone to talk to directly. They tried once to engage in a dialogue process with people working or people within the protest movement. It failed dramatically. There has not, to this date, been any other further attempts to have dialogue or to engage in dialogue with people who are protesting, these massive groups of people on the street. Now you can see in the picture on the right, they're holding up their hands like this with their 5 fingers, okay? This is the 5 demands, not one less. I can't say this in Cantonese, I wish I could, but this is what they'd be chanting all the time. 5 demands, not one less. And the 5 demands are here. The protest came about because the government in March, April of last year introduced a bill in legislature that was an extradition bill. And that extradition bill would allow the Hong Kong government to extradite people back to China. Now, China has a remarkably different legal system than Hong Kong. Hong Kong still has strong remnants of the British legal system and rule of law. And the Chinese legal system is remarkably different. There was no consultation about this bill, and it was basically on a rapid course through Congress. It didn't go through the regular bills consultation period. It didn't have any of that, and it was just pushed through. I didn't mean to say Congress. It was pushed through into the Legislative Assembly, and very little consultation. Well, people were absolutely furious. So one of the key demands was the full withdrawal of the extradition bill. Then on June 12th, the police categorized a demonstration as a riot. And of course, giving that categorization allows the police to take different actions and to charge people with much more serious crimes. And so one of their demands is a retraction of this riot designation to the June 12th demonstration. The third one was to release and exonerate arrested protesters, particularly those who had been involved in violence, to demand an independent commission of inquiry into police behavior, which has been consistently rejected by the government. And the last one is universal suffrage, which one man, one vote, which is not part of the Hong Kong system. So this is a timeline, it's taken from a Lancet paper that was published by the School of Public Health. People who were working on looking at the impact of the protests on depression. And I'm going to give you some of that data a little later. So you can see that the protest timeline, it begins April 3rd when they introduced the legislative proposal on the extradition bill. And on the timeline, you can see that June 16th, where 2 million people marched. Now, there was a time when they attacked the Legislative Council. So between June 16th and July 1st, protesters stormed the Legislative Council. The police literally just stood by and let them do it. They broke all the glass, went into the legislative chamber, vandalized the legislative chamber. It's cost a huge amount of money to replace it, but the police just let it happen. But one of the more important events that happened that is still creating issues today happened on July 21st. And this is when protesters were going home on the mass transit railway. And they were going out into a rural community in Hong Kong. And they were met by a group of thugs, probably triad members, effectively sort of mafia type of people. There's films of them and there's film of this happening. They're all dressed in white and they went onto the train and they beat people with metal bars. And the police didn't arrive for about 45 minutes. So this has just added fuel to the fire. And you can see from the timeline, it's continued. Now the paper was published, so the timeline ended on the 8th of December. However, we still have protests going on, even though we're in the middle of COVID-19 and in the middle of extreme social distancing, like all of you are. There are still protests going on in Hong Kong. People are still being arrested. And COVID has only dampened the protests, not stopped them. So by the sort of end, even though it's not really ended, but there were two major events that occurred in January. And that was the attacking of the Chinese Yuan and the destruction of Chinese Yuan and the attacking of Polytechnic University. These pictures sort of demonstrate what happened here, and the data here is how much the police were trying to intervene here. So I've run out of time, but I'm going to be very quick. There have been a lot of people who've looked at what's happening to the students as a result of this, and I think this is what's important for this discussion. So the consequences to students is that they don't want to go to school anymore. They can't concentrate, they can't focus, they're replaying events in their mind. They are conflict weary, very conflict weary. And in a city that prides itself on Confucian values and family ties are really broken. This sign says, why go to school when there is no future? And this is very characteristic of how these students see their world and their life these days. There are tutorial schools being put up where the title here in Chinese is "You Dream, I Tutor," where dreaming is you go out and protest and I'll help you get through the schoolwork. This is data from research that our school has done, as I said earlier. At the end of Occupy Central, 14 months after Occupy Central, the underlying prevalence of moderate depression was 77% at the end of, or just recently within the protest movement. Depression is around 11% in Hong Kong, which is a huge increase and a huge underlying rate of depression. I'm just going to push back forward to these. There's also, as Esteban said, real breakdown of norms. So medical workers were being arrested by the police because they said they were really protesters and not medical workers. I did a survey of specialist physicians in January and got this message back from a specialist physician. And it says, black clothed protesters equal university students, you go die. And that was his response to the survey. So in March, as of March of 2020, 7,300 people have been arrested. 1,200 of them are under 18 and 4,600 between 19 and 30. These are medical workers at the front, and they're protesting. And they were protesting with COVID-19, and they're protesting against the government, and they're protesting because of the relationship to China and Hong Kong. So this is my last slide. I'm sorry to be over time. So what's the takeaway? There's things that we need to do. We need to manage student mental health because we know we have a huge burden of mental health issues in the population, and they will be in the student population as well. We need to recognize that students lead multiple lives. They're activists, they're students, they're activists, they're citizens, they're parents, and their children. They have all of these activities going on, all part of their lives. We need to channel and engage students with political and social ideas and use these to inform our pedagogical aims, just like Esteban was saying. These students are engaged, are socially engaged in very profound ways. And just as my quote is at the bottom, we need to remember that medicine is a social science and politics is nothing but medicine on a large scale. And these students have huge health issues and we need to look after them. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Janice. And I think that quote's a very good quote for now, for all of us as we think about dealing with the pandemic. So I'd like to call on the last speaker, Jocelyn de Jong, and she's now going to talk about her experience in Beirut. Thank you.
So thank you very much. So I'm joining you from Beirut in Lebanon, and I'm based at the Faculty of Health Sciences, and I'll talk about public health. Projecting here.
Dorothy, can we get some help, possibly?
There we go. Okay, so I'll, if someone there could control the slides. There seems to be a technical error with
Great, here we go.
Okay. So I'll be talking about public health education from the perspective of the Faculty of Health Sciences at the American University of Beirut in the context of three overlapping crises. A larger regional crisis in the Middle East, and very much at the center of that is the Syria war, which began in 2011. And then a national economic and political crisis. And then lastly, overlaying on this and overlapping with it is the COVID crisis that we're currently experiencing. So the national economic and political crisis really began in the fall and then escalated in October with the outbreak of a revolution that took mass popular uprisings, taking to the street and protesting long decades of economic mismanagement and corruption. The protest resulted in the resignation of the government and eventually in the formation of a new government, which has been under huge pressure to implement reforms, long-awaited reforms. And overlaying this has been the emergence of the COVID epidemic. Next slide, please. So it's interesting to be in a panel about Chile and about Hong Kong, when in fact the protests that were happening in Lebanon were actually simultaneous. So the Lebanese Revolution in October 2019 was an incredibly unprecedented event in Lebanon's tumultuous history. Unprecedented because it brought people who had never been protesting before, never been active together before. It brought people from different religious sects in a country that's highly divided along religious lines, different age groups, different social classes, women and men, and people throughout Lebanon to the streets. And as you can see, their main demands, very much similar to some of the other demands we've been hearing about today, were about corruption, mismanagement, the lack of social justice, and the lack of human development. Next slide, please. So the crisis in Lebanon is very much linked to, as I said earlier, this larger regional crisis. The flow of refugees into the country was huge after the 2011 the outbreak of the war in Syria, to the extent that now almost 1 in 6 residents are a Syrian refugee, and there's over 1 million population of refugees living in formal settlements and substandard housing, etc. Not being able to work in most sectors, the poverty rate is extremely high and health problems are pervasive. But at the same time, the country is highly indebted and has accumulated a massive amount of debt. In fact, it has the credit of being one of the most indebted countries in the world and has recently defaulted on its debts. And all this has resulted in rising unemployment, the loss of jobs, the salary cuts, and huge burden on Lebanese families. Next slide, please. So looking at the health system in this context, the determinants of the crisis in itself has these larger determinants which are huge in scale. So the geopolitical factors. Next slide, please. So interference by outside players, the strategic position of Lebanon. Lebanon is a country that has been constantly buffeted by events and players beyond its borders. And then there are the, next slide please, the unresolved issues, the long-standing popular demands, the deterioration of the infrastructure ever since the civil war that has never really been repaired, the garbage crisis that gained Lebanon quite a lot of fame, the electricity failure with the collapse of the electricity infrastructure. Then there are the national factors. Next slide, please. This being one of the worst, or if not the worst, political and economic crisis that the country has experienced since the Civil War. And then the underlying economic problems, the economic inequality, that again was a factor in the earlier presentations. So here we have this wide context of crisis, which has had a huge effect on both health and the health system, even if our academic research hasn't quite caught up with measuring it. So if we think of the health system in Lebanon, it's an extremely privatized one where the provision of healthcare is much more according to people's ability to pay than actual health need. And the crisis itself has affected the extent of information that's available within the health system and is inadequate in terms of measuring the impact of the crisis. In terms of financing, it's undermined the basic ability to purchase supplies in a highly import-dependent economy. In terms of human resources, the staffing of the health facilities has been deeply affected with cuts in salaries, firing of staff, people having to work on half salaries, and adding to an already low morale. And in terms of the service delivery, the quality of the services has deteriorated rapidly since October, and of course putting the system in a very vulnerable position as it now confronts the COVID epidemic. And then lastly, in terms of medicines and technologies, again, with the lack of funds to purchase equipment, the system is vulnerable. Next slide, please. So where does an academic public health institution fall within this setup? So we're at the American University of Beirut, which dates from the 19th century. and is a liberal arts education considers itself both a Lebanese institution, but also a regional institution, but is also an American institution. We're based at the, next slide please, at the Faculty of Health Sciences. And the Faculty of Health Sciences actually began in 1954 and has a long experience of addressing public health issues in context of uncertainty. So in fact, this was the theme of our 60th anniversary conference. How do you teach students about public health? How do you conduct research that has an impact on public health in a context of constant uncertainty? But at the same time, this uncertainty has motivated us, I think, to always work for a greater impact. And we're proud that recently we were able to obtain our second CIF accreditation in difficult circumstances. But because the faculty and staff are absolutely so committed to working to deliver quality programs. Next slide, please. So as we experience this crisis since October and now the overlapping COVID crisis, what are some of the concerns that we've seen students experience? Well, in October, there was a huge desire on the part of many of the particularly Lebanese students to participate in the protests. And for a month, the university was closed. And they were indeed on the streets, which and participating protests, which were remarkably peaceful. But at the same time, they knew that they needed to attend classes and to complete what they could in order to graduate. But just as we heard in Hong Kong, students were enormously distracted, and they were worried about whether they would be able to complete the semester and complete their academic requirements. But they also had many economic concerns on their minds as their family members, cousins, etc. lost jobs or had reduced salaries. And many of our students are part-time, and many of them are also health professionals. And so they were highly stressed and receiving on both ends this stress situation within the health system. So as earlier presentations have mentioned, the mental health issues have been huge, and the university had to play a critical role in addressing those. At the same time, like any university, there's a diversity of political views, and an academic environment, it's an open environment in which these views should be aired. So students were also struggling at home with weak internet, just as we are now. And also international students were concerned about their security. Although again, I would have to add that this was a highly peaceful protest and there were very few deaths. They were more worried about street closures and not being able to move around and get to the university. Next slide, please. So what about the faculty, and what are some of the concerns that the faculty have been experiencing? Well, as always in these kind of crises, they engender a great deal of uncertainty and inability to plan. They were also concerned about being challenged to complete the curriculum and to assess students, particularly as we had to move to online learning for that month in the fall and now fully online. And there was varying readiness on the part of the faculty to engage in online teaching, and again, struggling with weak internet infrastructure in their own homes. But faculty are also worried about the financial aspects with the devaluation, unofficial devaluation of the local currency and the inability to obtain US dollars because of capital controls on the banks. There have been different concerns for the Lebanese and the growing non-Lebanese faculty at our university and within our own faculty. But there was a very strong solidarity and a support, which I think was key in getting us through the crisis. And again, there were diverse views in relation to the political events. But again, the environment of the university was such where these views could be aired and discussed. Next slide, please. So what did we do as a university and as a faculty to address some of these challenges? Well, the first thing we had to do was to close the university during the time of the revolution, and eventually to extend the semester to make sure that we could complete all the academic requirements. But the revolution and the crisis that was engendered around that, through it, was also a huge opportunity for our students to see public health issues right in front of their own eyes. So for both the international students and the Lebanese students, the issues of social justice, the issue of popular and community mobilization around key concerns affecting human life were the best lesson that anyone could teach them. On a more practical level, we had to postpone the final exams and restructure assignments, and we had to do that very quickly. We had to move to online teaching. We had to address the real financial needs of our students and reach out to international students who understandably had huge concerns, some of them wanting to return home, but by and large, most of them staying in the country and participating in this whole experience. The wellness unit of the university was critical, and as I said, mental health and counseling, ongoing throughout this crisis and now online, has been absolutely critical to help students through this time. And critically, within the classroom, within faculty meetings, there was a space to tolerate differences of opinion and different views of the future and where the government and
We're going to see if Jocelyn is able to get back on, and otherwise we'll move on to the Q&A.
It's okay, we are in Lebanon. This is what happens here.
Yes, it's happening more here too. Okay, I think we're going to move on to the Q&A, and then we'll give Jocelyn a chance to speak in that period if she comes back. I want to thank each of the speakers. I've learned so much from what you've communicated, and I also realize that the scale of what you've experienced is quite different from what we've experienced in the United States, and I think we have much more to learn from you as we face the consequences of COVID-19. We're going to have about 8 minutes for Q&A, and I see that there are 2 questions already, so I'm going to start with those. The first is for Janice. Please, how do we take care and help young people and their demands as a public health matter? I think
Unmute. I'm unmuted, it's okay.
Thank you.
Holy crow, what a difficult question. We have put in place in the last year, just like Jocelyn was talking about, we're calling it the Public Health Hub. And basically it's a wellness center for the students. But our students have been gone since the 15th of November. We've gone online. So we're not an online school. But from the 15th of November, when the protests got so bad, we've been online since then. We had 1 month in January where the students came back. And we have been online with COVID-19 since, and I am hopeful but not confident that we will back on in face-to-face teaching in September. But I have been warned by the dean that that may not happen, and be prepared to be online in September. So how do we deal with the students? Hugely problematic. It's a huge problem for us because half of my class are students from mainland China. The students came back and had class in January. Then there's an enormous holiday in China called Chinese New Year. This is extraordinarily important family holiday. The mainland students, which is about half of my class, went back to China to be with their families and that's exactly when the Wuhan crisis hit, and they are still in China. So we are doing everything by Zoom, just like you guys are. We're all learning by the seat of our pants. And we have regular synchronous contact with the students. But I have a number of students that although they're signing into class, they sign in on Zoom. I cannot have audio communication with them. They're either refusing to communicate or whatever. So I have a couple of students that it's extremely difficult to follow up with them and to carry through. So what we're really trying to do in terms of trying to deal with their mental health issues at the moment is, number one, keep contact with them all the time. So we're running all kinds of extra seminars, things online, as well as their normal learning activities, and trying to go from there. For the students that I have seem to have lost contact with, I'm trying to work through their friends and their friend circles to try to reestablish. For the local Hong Kong students, it's actually more difficult because they are engaged in their family units and they're not as receptive to the school as they are within their family units. So we're just trying to, within the program itself, just keep talking to the kids all the time. Well, they're not kids, they're adults, but keep talking to them all the time. We have the same issue with our undergraduate program, actually. It's just as difficult.
So what you're talking about really is becoming a global phenomenon as faculty all over the world are now having to teach remotely on very short notice. And it's
absolutely
striking how much we all have in common. Would the other two panelists, well, maybe Esteban.
Jocelyn's back online.
Oh, good. Jocelyn, I'm glad you're back. Would you like to comment on how you've stayed connected with students and what kind of mental health support you've provided? It's clear that each of you you've each described mental health challenges and threats. How have you dealt with them?
Me?
Sure. And then we'll go to Jocelyn.
Okay, so I feel a bit uncomfortable by doing classes online. I know that I have to do them, but you lose a lot of interaction, especially when the classes are essentially a debate or engaging. But on the other hand, I don't want to be self-referent on this, but during the first semester, when the revolution started in Beirut, the first day that we had classes after the Thawra, I went into class and I told my students, it's a good thing, we do not need to change anything in the curriculum because the content of our course was actually made to understand this. It is the inclusion of ideas of exploitation, of corruption, of social inequalities and how they are deeply rooted in the economic conditions. And on the other hand, this semester we have also had the chance to continuing delivering classes, but also developing what we call a reading group on Marxism and public health. And because it's online, now we include people from Chile, from Sudan, and from Lebanon. It's been a very interesting challenge, but with important shortcomings, especially the face-to-face interaction with students, that at least from my perspective, but it also gives us some opportunities.
Thank you. Thank you. Jocelyn, would you like to comment? And I'm sorry we lost you for a little while.
Sorry, the internet infrastructure. So so I think one of the key things is the system of advising and having instructors close contact with the students. I think our structures are such that there's a lot of interaction between professors in their classes and the students. We're lucky that our classes are not enormous. So I think that constant interaction, but we meet with this, we hold something called a town hall meeting once a semester with the students, the dean and the associate dean. And I think that's really helpful to just provide a safe space where people can bring up any sort of concerns. And one of the things that we always stress to the students in those discussions is that their solidarity, so the extent to which there's social support among the students, their WhatsApp groups, their keeping in touch with each other when someone isn't in touch to regularly get in touch. I think that's really important. We're lucky that we have an excellent counseling service at the university, but I think like many places around the world, the counseling services are just overwhelmed, in the best of circumstances, and then in crisis circumstances when there's so much uncertainty. So I think, work for the academics to work closely with them. One of the things that we've also realized is that we really need to train. We need to have faculty more aware about mental health issues. So recently there's been an initiative started to try and do that, to give courses to, short courses to faculty, what to expect, what can you do, what systems of support can you set up. I think that's really important because many times, we ourselves aren't so familiar with the issues of mental health when we confront them.
Thank you. I think we're going to have to forego the other questions, which is really a shame because some of the questions were about what measures should be advocating to support efforts to address COVID while at the same time as basic human needs. Are there any benefits, positives associated with the events in Lebanon and Hong Kong, any kind of mental health benefit? But we're not, unfortunately, going to be able to answer those questions today. I want to thank each of the panelists. I think one of the fundamental messages we've gotten today is that we're experiencing many of the same kinds of issues around the world. In a meeting earlier today, we talked about meeting the mental health needs of students and some of the issues of faculty and the concerns in this country and countries around the world about unemployment and how unrest and unemployment are going to exacerbate inequity. I think, as we often find, we're more alike than we're different, although the scale is different in different countries. I want to thank everybody who has been participating today and apologize for not getting to all your questions. And I want to remind you that a recording of this webinar will be available shortly on the ASPPH website. And as you close out of the session, please take a moment to complete a very brief survey, and you'll see it on your web browser. And then there are many other sessions for the virtual annual meeting. So I encourage you to participate and have a chance to learn more, even as we're all absorbing the horrific events around COVID-19. Thank you so much, and I want to wish you all good health.